Hi, you are listening to the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. This podcast is for policymakers, governments, researchers, students, businesses, and anyone that is interested in conflict and development issues in Africa. On this podcast, we hear from experts from across Africa and the world. Your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa, will ask the questions you would want answers to. Michael Nwankpa has an extensive experience spanning over a decade studying, researching, writing, and consulting on conflict and development issues in Africa.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa. Today we're going to be discussing the campaign for an African permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council. I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Adeoye Akinola. Dr. Akinola is the head of units and head of research and teaching at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation in South Africa. Dr. Akinola, I'm very, very pleased to have you join me today, and I look forward to an exciting conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Michael, and thanks for having me on your very stimulating conversation programs, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, brilliant. But before we get into the question, I want to just tell our audience to stay tuned to the end and subscribe and like and share this video at the end of the day. Yes, let me begin. So we've recently seen, or Africa has long campaigned for an inclusive United Nations Security Council, and they've long campaigned for having representation in that framework. But we've seen recent campaign for and which have received fresh boost from the United Nations Security General Antonio Guterres and other African, like Sierra Leone president. What is your assessment of this campaign overall?
Maybe I should first state that I think it's something that is long overdue, is belated, and sometimes we speak about it without actually committing ourselves to the task of assisting even the P5, the permanent member of the Security Council, to make their work easier. And I think the call, it couldn't have come at any better time. We can see from the north to the south, from the east even to the west, that the world needs leadership. There are conflicts across board, not only in Africa, even in Europe, and not only in Europe, and that's why I'm saying in other places in the world. And we can also think about the escalation of conflict even between Israel and Palestine, the unresolved conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and we can see in Africa also conflict relapse all over the place. So the time has actually come. It's not just about reforming, it's just to rethink the global architecture of peace and security. Definitely something is not working well, and that's why it is imperative that people speak about reforming the UN Security Council, because that's the ultimate organ of the UN General Assembly, or United Nations generally, that has enforcing capacity, and in a way they are like the global police. So it seems as if that there's failure from the part of the UN Security Council to police the world. So we begin to now question the composition, the structure, the character, the nature of the UN Security Council. And I'm particularly happy that even the UN Secretary General will lend his voice openly without mincing his word to say we cannot, after about 76 years, that we have to reform. And we can also maybe later in the show question that maybe we need more than reform, but at the minimum, something must change for us to enjoy peace, prosperity, and development in the world.
Joko, I like what you said about the world needs leadership. So we've seen in the last is it 70 years now, but since the end of the Second World War, and we've seen the United Nations have been, that kind of like overarching body that supervises conflict or mediates or conflicts around the world. But in recent times, we've seen that the UN itself as a structure is needing reform or needing rethink. So what we've been seeing is reconfigurations at different levels of. So whereas we had at the end of the Cold War, we had where America emerged as the hegemon, but right now we don't even have we have more like multiple hegemons. We have different configurations, the BRICS. You have expansion of whether the G7. So we're seeing all of these. So I agree with you that all of these speak to the need for leadership, and there's been like poor leadership. And I'm happy you mentioned this is not just in Africa. As usually people will say it's everywhere. In America, we've seen the debates. There's lack of quality leadership. So in all of this, Africa is becoming increasingly important, and a jostling among not just the superpowers, the usual suspect. We see even the mid powers in Turkey jostling for that in Africa. So what is the scale of Africa's significance in all of this? And what are the factors that are driving this?
Thank you so much. I think we have to start from the global south and dovetail into Africa. If you look at the geopolitics in the last maybe like 7 years, 5 years, and particularly after COVID or even during COVID, we are beginning to see a reconfiguration of global polarity. Like you said, power has shifted from being one unilateral actor to this multiplicity of relative big powers and medium powers, trying to act and get their voice also heard in the international scene as individual countries. But when it comes to the global institutions of governance we have, not only the UN, we can look at even G20, for instance. And it's not a coincidence that the presidency of G20 moved from Indonesia 2022 to India. From India to Brazil, from Brazil now, South Africa will be the president next year. And if you look at them, in the past three president, Indonesia, India, Brazil, and even South Africa. Those are countries in the global south. So I don't think it's a coincidence. That shows the relevance of the global south in the global politics, which we haven't seen or we didn't see during the Cold War, before the Cold War, and even shortly after the Cold War. Now, if you want to come to Africa, of course, now people say Black Lives Matter. No, African lives matter. That's what is in vogue now. And it's not even by accident that the African Union was admitted as a permanent member of the G20. It wasn't an accident. They had no choice but to admit the African Union. Look at it this way. The African Free Trade Architecture Initiative will be the biggest bloc, trade bloc in the entire world. Africa in the next 2 years will be talking about 1.5 billion population. And you also know it's not just about the population, but you look at the demographics, the categorization of the population, where we have almost 60% of the population, they are youth, they are disenergized people, and you can compare that to Europe, where majority of the population are aged people, collecting retirement fund. Now let's come to mineral resources. Just Congo DRC enough. Is enough for the entire world to want to scramble to get the soul of Congo DRC. So you look across Africa, and to me, Africa is the future. Either the world likes it or not, people can debate it, but for big power, they understand that Africa is the future. That's why you see countries like Saudi Arabia, country like Turkey, country like Qatar having this, very strange, interest in Africa. So the time has come, and I hope African political elite will be able to take advantage of this blank check that has been opened before them. But if they are not careful, they will still continue to rely relate as if, the era of dependency of colonialism. So that's why I say that this is the time for Africa to actually push for reform, at the minimum, reform across board, not only UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly itself, then IMF, World Bank. So, well, this is the right time to make those push. Yes.
Very, very interesting. It's people call it like the thought scramble for Africa. Now you mentioned that was trouble. I will talk about DRC. DRC is very blessed, mineral, all kind of land, forest, and then those countries as well, countries that are beleaguered with conflict. But you've said something very, very interesting in how this thing shifts. Whereas in the first scramble or coming up to the second, colonial destiny, it was an unequal, imbalanced relationship where Africa was just more extractive, extracting resources from Africa. But now there is an opportunity for Africa to be able to play a big role in determining how that relationship is. How do you think Africa is doing currently? Because you're talking in terms of hoping like Africa is able to do, but if you look at currently, how is Africa doing?
Well, somebody called it a pessimistic hope, not an optimistic hope. We can only hope because we are also African. And I think I want to also boldly say, if Africa gets it right, they may play a very prominent role even in global governance, in providing global leadership. But to be frank, as it is, African leaders have woefully performed. It's as if they have not really realized maybe the nature of the international system, the shifting of polarity, and the advantage they can explore within the global system. I know that there's still a symmetry relation whereby Africans are still dependent, but it doesn't matter if you are dependent or not. But the main question is that the world needs Africa, not because they loved African, but because that has come it has become a reality because of their mineral resources, because of their human capacity, because of also we talk of demographics of population where you have young people with diverse skills, being raised even from Africa. But imagine our leaders, and I remember that President Ruto of Kenya said during his campaign that he was also alarmed that Africans would pack themselves in a bus and go to the US for one US African summit. And you cannot even imagine that there is, a small country, Japan African Summit. Japan will summon about 54 African leaders to travel to leave their country and come to Japan. And I went to Saudi recently, and they were talking to me about when African leaders came last year to Saudi African Summit. This is embarrassing, actually. A president will summon about 54 presidents, and last week they were all in China, and they were happy to post in the camera. They have not understood what is going on in the world. Maybe sometimes you have clout, you might not know, and because many of them are also they're lacking in leadership and understanding, and maybe because most of them also they are more European, more American than American, because all their investments they are there, but many of them even live in Europe. Some of them I don't want to mention. I can mention about two that lived in Europe as president of African countries. So they have not performed, they have not led. And unfortunately, because they are also disconnected with the civil society organization and the think tank community and academic community, they don't even hear some of what we say to them. And some of our researches, they don't even read it. And even when they read it, they think we don't know what we are doing. So I'm particularly sad that African leaders have not taken advantage of the crack in global leadership to also begin to reinforce the voice of Africa to assert their authority at the global stage.
When you were saying that, I was shaking my head because I was writing that before you mentioned it. You've had Africa, Russia summit, Africa, China, and even when I mentioned ECAS to you before we started recording this, ECAS is like the biggest European conference on Africa, but it's not happening on African soil. And then you have where academics from Africa are being denied visa en masse to come to Europe. And why are we talking about Africa and you're not talking about Africa on African soil? Imagine bringing that to Africa to come and talk on African soil. And so I completely agree with you on the crop of leadership that we have in Africa and how it might be a question of poor leadership. But how do we change this? We've also seen some progression, maybe with because some of the key voice that is calling for this UN seat is the youngest president in Africa, Sierra Leone. So if you're looking at, are we seeing, because we can't just lump all of these people. So can you see some pattern, or can you see something that gives a glimmer of hope with the Sierra Leone president with some of this in terms of what the future could be?
Well, it's not really by activism that the Sierra Leone president is speaking, because he's speaking as a member of the UN Security Council. You remember, Sierra Leone is in the UN Security Council as one of the elected members, so it is on that platform. I don't really, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but let Sierra Leone leave the Security Council today, then you may never hear them speaking about a reform of the UN Security Council. But I'm also saying, of course, there are some movements even within Africa, and I can, because I live in South Africa, I could see the energy driving, because there's this big expectation that what India started, that Brazil inherited as the president of the G20, that will be coming to South Africa next year. That there's this energy that South Africa have said it repeatedly, that they will use that platform to also push for the reform, of the United, not only UN, but all those global institutions of reform. And you will know that when the president of South Africa was the chair of the AU during COVID, he actually tried, that's Cyril Ramaphosa, to try to locate Africa in the global context and to reinforce this ongoing dependency, if I call it vasting appetite, to say, why are they denying Africans humanity? So if South Africa becomes the president, I think later this year, I think it should be November through next year, they will also push. But one has to recognize that if you have few African leaders that are bold to speak, because it's not all of the leaders, they are not even leaders, maybe we should call them rulers, maybe we should use African rulers. Well, maybe some other people get themselves in power, maybe they will be able to push more for, for just not just reform, but for the centralization of African concern at the global stage.
Yeah, you there's some key things you mentioned, and those things also tie into, you talk about the centralization of African concern, and I think again that is one of the things. So two things that this is the question. Number one, the dependency relationship, and how does that, when you're depending on someone, maybe foreign aid. Some countries in Africa that their budget for their day-to-day, it's been, is reliant on external aid. So how do you have then the power or the credibility to be, in the UN? And then again, the centralization of African stuff. Who is going to, let's say, for instance, they're going to give an African seat. How do we reconcile who is going to be in charge of the 44 countries? Is there not going to be a competition among, is the AU going to be able to handle and deal with anything that comes from there? How are we able to centralize and put African needs? What is there even a Central African need to begin with?
I think we can. Let's start from the Zuluweni consensus on the reform of the UN Security Council. Africa has a position, and I've not seen any African country speaking against the consensus. It was facilitated by the African Union, remember, and they agreed that this is the position we are pushing. led by the African Union and their members. The African Union is not a member of the United Nations or the UN Security Council, but we have the A3, that's the 3 African representatives in the Security Council, Sierra Leone, I think Sierra Leone, Mozambique, and another country currently. Now, people have spoken about the question you have raised. Okay, if we were even to say African come on the play, which African country? There's disunity in Africa. Africa is not united. There's no African voice. There's nothing like seeking African solution to Africa. The institute partner with the Nordic African Institute, and we are working on it on the UN Security Council. Particularly, we are looking at the relationship between the P5, the A3, and how, the E10, those are the elected 10 representatives at the council, and how the African representative can also collaborate and nuance themselves. And there's something that came out. I kept saying, we don't need one single voice as 54 countries to demand for expansion of the permanent membership of the Security Council. Despite our dependency status, despite the fact that some of our countries still depend on external funding or whatever, it doesn't make you inhuman. It doesn't remove the humanity in African across board. And people have spoken about how weak African country is, that where the big powers, the multinational corporation, the argument that in the international system, the states are not even the main actor, talk less of an African state to do what we call, you remember at that time when they shut the state borders, despite the fact that many of the multinational corporations were putting pressure on the state not to do that. Even the big powers are still trying to say relax. But for instance, South Africa, they shut many things, many policies. There are many strategies that a dependent country can initiate for you. It would not be like that. We are not saying African countries will now rise and they are now equal with the United States. But what we are talking about is for countries in the global north to take African countries seriously. Despite your dependency, they can still take you seriously. And Africa shouldn't be as dependent as they are if we have leaders. This country should be coming to Africa, not Africa going to them. Africa has everything that it needs to survive as a nation and to survive as a people. We have the human capacity, we have the natural resources, we even have this very friendly nature. Everywhere agricultural will boom in Africa. There are places you don't need fertilizer. There are of course, there's climate change, but relatively we can predict rainfall and people can farm without even using some of those. So it is our fault that we are still dependent. It's not something that should be a permanent situation. China is no longer dependent. Brazil is no longer dependent. South Korea is no longer dependent. The Taiwan, the Asian tigers. Of course, we know we are not in the same situation, but Africa can leverage themselves and just be self-sufficient based on what they have.
I like the statement where you say it is our fault that we are still dependent. So that kind of aligns with some of the things I have said about it still goes back to leadership. And you mentioned something earlier on. You talked about the disconnection between African leaders and the civil society, and then the academics. So and one of the things people don't know that motivated this me establishing this center and all of this stuff with the game is actually I've seen like there's a divide. African leadership or African governments don't rely so much on policy like what we see in rest of the places where institutes like yours would do reports and then the government is in line with those reports. They're looking at the report, they're acting in accordance with those things. African governments just aborted that policies are not research driven. So how do we change this? Looking again at the consciousness of the people, the consciousness, we see the demographic, like you mentioned, is changing. But there's still a long way. How do we change the demographic whereby we can pursue? So if I look if I look at Nigeria, for instance, I see what's going on in Nigeria, where the leadership benefits from the division, among the people, divided along different kind of like identities. But again, how do we move from there and have a civil society that is going to make the leadership act right? Because again, we can't put everything at the feet of the leadership. The civil society has to be able also to be able to pressure the government to act right. How do we begin to change those dynamics?
This is tricky, and if you know, there was the waves of civil society activism across Africa in the 80s, particularly after the introduction of structural adjustment program, which were consciously or unconsciously actually re-energized the civil society as they began to resist some of those policies. And those were periods where we also have military governments in some of the countries, particularly Nigeria, that you mentioned. But one thing I realized was that at that time, the civil society was strengthened against the military. And immediately they were able to, one way or the other, depose the military. They just retracted, not conscious, as if they didn't prepare for anything else. So many of these strong civil society began to dissolve. But as we are now, of course, we have seen recently a pickup, resurgence of the civil society. But one thing that you will also know is that African government do not even see the need to strengthen the civil society because they see them as opposition. That's contrary to what you will see in the global north or in advanced democracy in other climate, because they understand the contribution of the civil society to governance, but that's not the way African leadership will see civil society. They see them as the enemy, so they starve them of fund. So where would civil society get funding from? They turn to Europe, and when maybe Europe, America, or even China, and even Russia, even Saudi Arabia. And you also understand the politics driving all of this donorship. That look, we have to promote the agenda. It's difficult for civil society in Africa working on African issues, trying to decolonize some of the issues to get funding. We still have maybe a few donor organizations that will still grab funding, but it's difficult. But I am particularly happy to the commitment of the youth. You will see that in the last few years, the youth are beginning to come into this governance space, and they are trying to let the leaders know that we can force changes. They did that in Senegal. You remember, we are not even talking of the Arab Spring. Even after Arab Spring in Senegal, they did that. In South Africa 2015, we had the social movement we call Fee Must Fall movement that cut across Africa and even grounded governance. In Senegal, we had the same thing under President Sol when he didn't want to leave power and relatively they forced him out of power. We had it in Kenya, and it has not even ended in Kenya. In Nigeria, we had the SARS. Remember, we had the SARS protests against police brutality and in code against bad governance. And in the last few weeks, we had protests in Nigeria. So we will continue to see this. And as we are seeing this, some of those youths are trying to get a space within the structure of the civil society. And one way or the other, they will begin to force their voices to be heard. And maybe one will also credit the African Union for strengthening ECOSOC. We have the ECOSOC in Lusaka that are also trying to galvanize civil society across Africa to be able, to make their own input into governance, because governance, you are not governing cows, you are governing human beings, and these are the human beings, and their voices are exceedingly important. South Africa will have left. Nobody expected that the African National Congress, the ANC, will almost lose out of power. Those are so. You are now beginning to see a relative shift and consciousness in Africa, the youth, and also the middle class to say, no, we can't reject this. And one way or the other, we'll have a way to force our voices to be heard. So I see projection of this in the next few years.
I agree with you 100%. And that's some of the conclusions that I came to in my recent book when I was talking about democracy in Nigeria and the militarized democracy. I said particularly the youth, and then the women. You didn't mention women. I think women as well are going to play a big role in Africa and the change that has come in Africa. But Africa as well, some of the things we don't understand also is that in Africa, we've seen that African Union, you mentioned the AU, you've seen, like, again, we talk about the Africa's role in the global architecture of peace. And Africa, one of the things that, like, Guterres was talking about, the argument they were making, the case for Africa having a permanent seat, was also due to Africa's role in placed about 40% in terms of peace contribution to peace across Africa. You have African missions in Somalia. You have in different other places. But yet there's still a prevalence of conflict in some of those places. Where is that dilemma? How do we reconcile all of that? What is causing? Why is there a prevalence of conflict?
Well, of course, most of the time, yes, we can point our fingers to the United Nations and particularly the UN Security Council. But when you point one finger, about 3 or 4 are also pointing at you. So sometimes we have to look within. Despite the fact that we expect the UN to intervene in several instances, but we have regional organization in West Africa. We have the ECOWAS, and you remember how strong ECOMOG, which is the Economic Monitoring Group, was, in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, in Cote d'Ivoire. We have SADC, in Southern Africa. So we have those tribes that ought to support, both African Union Peace and Security Initiative and also the UN. And I also understand the point you are making. We now begin to see some hybrid peacekeeping missions. We have in Somalia, in Sudan, where both the United Nations and the African cooperate. But one thing we have to note about the African Union, sometimes I criticize them, sometimes we expose what we think that they are not doing right, but we've got to understand the nature and the structure of the African Union itself. And sometimes we unilaterally compare it to compared to the European Union. There's a difference between a supranational organization and intergovernmental organization. The African Union is not a supranational organization with binding authority. It just operates like the United Nations, even less like the United Nations, because the UN Security Council can enforce, to some extent, and they have many mechanisms, which they can use. But for the African Union, is just solidarity, because it's an intergovernmental organization. Even when they pass resolutions, any state can disregard it. We saw it in West Africa when ECOWAS asked the military government of Niger to hand over, and they even threatened them, unfortunately, with force to invade the country, just dismiss it. And what happened? Nothing. So they later went back to just, normal sending peace missions and diplomatic conversation and all of that. So we've got to be mindful of that. But one thing that we will also know, I think the African Union can still do better, even despite the constraint that they have. But it also depends also on the willingness of the political elite. And that's one thing we kept saying about the African Union, that I think they should bring more technocrats into the space. The highest governing body of the African Unions are these presidents that we are condemning most of the time. I say the General Assembly, when they meet, they make resolutions. Sometimes it's very difficult to also, come against someone, because there's this comradeship among those presidents. They have a way of sharing coffee, around them. They don't really easily condemn, other countries. So we have to give it to the Africa. What mechanism do they have? Maybe suspension. And so what? ECOWAS, you suspended Mali, so what? You suspended maybe Niger, so what? Those countries. So at the base of it is that there are something dramatically wrong with the political economy of Africa, because conflict do not just erupt. And conflict in Africa most of the time is conflict of the belly. When people don't have the means of survival, they resort into violence. I was reading something on one of the countries in arms, and they say about 105 or 125 schools have shut down in the space of about 2 years because of conflict. So where are the puppies? Where are those young boys? They will be mobilized, to join any of the conflicting, parties. So those are the problem. If people cannot feed then they are vulnerable to conflict. So instead of trying to combat conflict, no, what you first deal with is governance. And we have seen it in the Sahel, across the Sahel, because people are angry because they are hungry. And that's why they could come, not directly, but they could welcome military governments. Not that they love the military, but they just felt that the civilian administration have performed woefully. So at the base of this is just poor leadership. That's nothing else.
I agree with you. And I think one of the things, like in my work as well, that is coming out is Africa has just not enjoyed the dividend of democracy, or whatever I see. Throughout since Africa has gained independence, and unfortunately, it doesn't look like the military, because that's been tried as well in the past. It doesn't look like the military is the solution for anything apart from the status quo. But if I ask you lastly, it's going to be a very broad question. Like you rightly mentioned, it does seem like that the AU itself needs reforming. The AU, because the AU was the Organization of African Union, and now from what you said now, it doesn't have much power, because we've seen whereby in the AU laws where if a country goes to coup and then they condemn and all of that, but now we're seeing that like Riley said, it's just suspension. So what? Nothing happened. It doesn't have any serious consequence. So do you not think the AU itself needs some reorganization, some strengthening in terms of having force to be able to, because what happened with ECOWAS and the Sahel was somehow kind of embarrassing, with the red lines and the stuff, and then all of that. So what do we need? Do we need a reform? Does the AU needs to be reformed first? Does Africa need? I guess the question is, before you go out, because you made a case that even though African governments some are weak, that doesn't take away the push for being in the UN Security Council. But then again, someone can say, if your house is shaky, how can you go out and talk about that? So how do we? So I guess the question: how does Africa position itself in a way where it is strong on that scene? So you don't want to go there and be seen as just this out of pity. Let's include you. Just like you be a force to be reckoned with. You be respected as member of that council with veto power and all that. So again, it comes to how do we recognize the power we have in terms of like the leadership we're talking about, going to China, going to this. How do we recognize that? What do we need to do to how do we bring all of that into form? So I want to take a broad and conclude with that broad.
I think when we look at let's start with their external projection of it's making a case for reform of the UN Security Council. When they gathered and they decided in 2005 to have this African common position on the reform of the UN Security Council, UN and the Security Council particularly, and this I think they call it a Zulweni consensus, and they agreed that we need 2 permanent seats in the Security Council, not just permanent seats with the privileges. We want 2 African countries to become permanent members, and they don't really want to retain veto power if possible, but they also make a case if they retain veto power in the council, then we want the permanent members who are new to also have the privileges of using these veto powers, and they also want them to be able to stay in a position where we call something pent holders, where they are able to draft solutions and all of that. And when they are saying 2 members, and you are thinking, so are there countries in their head? And we also know that countries like Nigeria wants to be a member, South Africa wants to be a member, Egypt wants to be, Senegal wants to be, and Kenya has also been trying to put themselves in a position where they are permanent member of the Security Council. So, but if you want to look at, one of my editorials last few weeks ago, I made that conclusion, but that you've got to look within. There are people dying in Sudan as we speak, and it's so shameful that Saudi Arabia, Turkey will now be the mediator when there are problems in Africa, you can see the case between Somalia and Ethiopia building up. And Ethiopia, AU is just in Ethiopia, the same seat of the African Union and the Ethiopian government. We saw how long the Tigray-Ethiopia conflict lasted. When we have the same government of Ethiopia and the African Union in the same city, and that thousands of people died. And today, I've not seen a peace mission from Nigeria to Sudan. I've not seen from South Africa to Sudan. Of course, I know that behind the scene there are diplomatic talks, but publicly, I've not seen the president of Nigeria, the president of Kenya, the president of South Africa leading African leaders to Sudan, leading African leaders to Congo DRC, just our neighbor here. And if these countries that aspire to be permanent members of the UN Security Council cannot even influence the security of their own regions, then what are they doing? Do they have that capacity to go and project externally? So what I'm trying to say, I resonate with what you said. We've got to start within. Of course, we want the UN to be reformed. We want expansion of spaces, but that will not solve Africans' problem overnight. Even if they put five African countries as permanent member of the Security Council, would that immediately solve the problem in Congo DRC? Would that solve, the problem in Cameroon? People don't even talk about Cameroon as if there's no conflict in Cameroon. It's just as if they can die as if they are not human beings. And I will see some African countries going to Ukraine to negotiate peace, going to Russia to negotiate peace when your neighbors, your house is on fire. So I don't understand sometimes how this will play out, even if they were going to extend the UN security permanent membership to some of these African countries. But for me, there's no African country that can beat its chest and said, yes, I have done my bit. No, they have not done their bit. Because sometimes we know those people foiling these wars. Sometimes you are thinking of Mozambique, for instance. Even before there were terrorist activities in Mozambique, in Sebagado, you knew as an analyst, there's early warning signal that if you are trying to bastardize a community because of natural resources and you are moving a community away from their original location without due compensation, what do you expect? We have seen it in Nigeria, we've seen it in Congo DRC, we've seen it in Angola. So that such will happen in Mozambique. And yet, what did African leaders do? What did they do? They just washed over it. And now that's the same way. I think they are looking at Somalia, they are looking at Somaliland, they are looking at Ethiopia. Now Egypt is coming into the picture by trying to enter a pact with Somalia, and Somaliland is crying foul, and Ethiopia is also warning Egypt. And I'm saying, do you have to wait until there's an escalation? That there's hostility, there's violence, there's escalation of conflict before you initiate peace missions? No, you have to prevent conflict. That's why we have the panel of the wise, by the African Union. That's why we have the early warning system. But those systems are not working, actually, absolutely. So, you have to also think about the African Union. Most of their resources are sourced from outside Africa. Many of the countries don't even pay their commitment to the African Union. The EU is almost entirely funding the African peace and security architecture. We have the ETF, I think it's ETF fund, that comes from the EU. The house where the EU is living is built by China. So when you consider all of this, we still have a long way to go as a continent, as I say, people.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Akinola. This is very rich conversation, and like you rightly said, we have a long way, and we can also see some prospects, but hopefully we're able to. But like you rightly said, you mentioned something about hope, pessimistic hope, or there's something said earlier on. So we can all but do our part, but I want to see a future that is an Africa that is prosperous, and one that is able to take its place in the global stage. Because like Riley said, it has all it takes. It has the resources, it has the human resources, it has everything it takes to be able to participate in that stage. Anyways, thank you very much for coming. Really appreciate it. I'll keep you posted once this airs, and then you help us share it among your network. So hopefully to get to those leaders and they're able to listen.
Hopefully. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Yeah. I need to.
Regard.
Bye. Yeah, bye. Thank you once again for tuning in this week to a very amazing episode on the campaign for a permanent African seat in the United Nations Security Council. Join me as usual to thank our guest, Dr. Adeoye Akinola, for his rich, insightful comments and views on this subject. Want to encourage you to subscribe. For those that are not yet subscribed to the channel for more of this, to get more updates, and please like and share this video. And for now, stay blessed, and I'll see you next time.